One of the important questions that we are exploring in the Beings Conference is the nature of creating novel life. What that means, what its implications are, whether that's really a new thing or an old thing, whether it's a question of doing something we've done for a long time just with increased power, or whether there's really a qualitative difference between the ways in which we're manipulating organisms today and the ways in which we did it in the past. So we're going to again have our two distinguished faculty members discuss this, and then a panel and comments as we did last time. And here to introduce our distinguished faculty for topic B are Jason Robert, Director of the Bioethics Policy and Law Program at Arizona State University, and Judy Wong-Taylor, who is the Co-Associate Dean of the School of Science and Technology at Georgia Gwinnett College. Thanks. Hello, Jason.
Ruha Benjamin is on the faculty of Princeton University and is the author of a book called People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, published in 2013 by Stanford University Press. She writes and speaks widely on the tension between innovation and equity in the US and more globally, and is actively involved in initiatives to transform public engagement with science, technology, and medicine. She has been awarded fellowships by the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Science Foundation, the Harvard Kennedy School, and the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, among other honors. Please join me in welcoming Ruha Benjamin.
Good morning. So it's an honor to participate in this important summit with all of you, and particularly in this session. As it turns out, I didn't need to go very far to begin reflecting on the issue of alien organisms and new identities. My mother, shown here, was legally classified as such until last year, when she became a naturalized US citizen. And so as we begin to think about the potential of cellular technologies to create new types of organisms, I'd like us to reflect on the political genealogy of this nomenclature, and that there are already so-called aliens walking among us, perhaps even in this room, and that most societies, in fact, struggle with the basics of incorporating our fellow human beings, labeled and treated alien. Our social technologies, unpatentable as they are, continue to prove quite rudimentary. And yet here we are discussing the possibility of engineering ourselves towards a biological utopia, social dystopias notwithstanding. The fact is, innovation and inequity too often go hand in hand. Social science research piled high shows that as we develop the capacity to control disease and death, the benefits go disproportionately to those who already monopolize resources. So that despite promises to the contrary, there really is no trickle-down biotechnology. We either prioritize these issues upstream, or we ensure a world that resembles Gattaca and Elysium, but where genetic castes do not simply replace race, gender, disability, nationality, but build upon and amplify these systems of domination. So that moving forward, I urge the delegates to take the power of imagination seriously, and remain watchful of the ways in which we may constrict what counts as relevant and meaningful to our deliberations. Cellular technologies, it turns out, have a way of animating our thinking about what's possible biologically, but hardly ever sociologically. Instead, our imaginations tend to go limp when we're confronted with social disorder. For many people, the idea that we can defy politics as usual and channel human ingenuity towards more cooperative and just forms of social organization is utterly far-fetched. Thus, I suggest one important step we can take together is accounting for the relative stock placed in biological regeneration as compared to an underdeveloped investment in social transformation. If our bodies can regenerate, why do we perceive our body politic as so utterly fixed? With that, I'd like to flag 5 ways in which we routinely and perhaps unintentionally constrict our ethical imaginations with respect to science in general and cellular technologies in particular. The first is an ahistoric fallacy, when we project forward in time without the temporal corollary, a careful examination of historical precedents and processes. Too often, the contours of our thinking mirror the hyperbolic rhetoric of science, breakthrough, cutting edge, and miraculous, leading us to overlook continuities as we train our attention on all that appears novel. The second is a legalistic fallacy, when we assume that reforming policies and laws is sufficient to shaping the context of science for the greater good. The passage of the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, for example, was necessary but not adequate to ensure that employers and insurance companies will not exercise bias against those found to have genetic predispositions to illness. Relatedly, while it's necessary for governments, including the US, to prohibit the creation of GM humans, especially given the role of private funding in scientific research, as the California-based Center for Genetic and Society rightly points out, civil society organizations, scientific and medical groups should also work to deepen public understandings of the differences between socially dangerous uses of biotech and applications that contribute to human flourishing. That is to say, legal interventions must go hand in hand with ongoing deliberation. The third is an informed fallacy, when we presume that standard approaches to informed consent are sufficient in arenas that are characterized by so much scientific and medical uncertainty. As Karis Thompson's analysis in Good Science shows with respect to somatic cell donation for iPS cell lines, as tissue proliferates and gets integrated into products, there's really no way to recall a person's genetic information that's embedded therein. Not to mention future GM humans, by definition, would not be able to consent to the biological experiments that are their bodies. The fourth is a fixed fallacy, which is the tendency to assume that the way in which scientific harms get enacted in the present will look the same way that they did in the past. This fallacy has us focus on examples of state-sponsored eugenics, overlooking the way that free market logics put the responsibility of racial fitness in the hands of the consumer. In this way, the fixed fallacy serves as a necessary counterweight to ahistoric tendencies by drawing our attention to the changing ethical landscape. The fifth and final way in we may inadvertently constrict our ethical imagination is through a euphemistic fallacy, which is when we adopt language that is already seeded with a particular perspective on biotech. For example, the notion of editing socially desirable traits that could be selected for tends to obscure the systems that make them desirable in the first place. So as we think together about the powerful role of language in constricting or expanding our ethical imagination, let's consider the comparison between gene editing and cosmetic surgery. On the surface, this analogy would seem to draw our attention to the routine and normalized qualities of cosmetic procedures. But not only is cosmetic surgery itself not merely cosmetic in terms of the rates of injury and death that are known to result, but even if safety concerns were fully addressed, such procedures continue to reinforce notions of fitness and beauty that are often deeply racist and misogynist at their core. One need only look to the number of people getting double eyelid surgeries and narrowing nose jobs, yet hardly ever the reverse, to understand that discourses of personal choice obscure the way that dominant ideologies shape the direction of preference. Likewise, gene editing offers one more stage on which to dramatize deep-seated dogmas, in which some kinds of bodies are coded more desirable than others. As executive director of CGS, Marcy Darnovsky explains, the idea that we can draw a clear and meaningful line between therapy and enhancement is really untenable at this point. So in moving forward, there are many ways to expand our ethical imagination, to actively prioritize justice and equity. I'll highlight only a few in the minute remaining. First and foremost, let's stop worshiping at the altar of individual choice, recognizing that consumer freedom is not the end-all, be-all of liberty and self-determination. In this way, feminist thinking about biotechnology is actually at the forefront of conceptualizing a more nuanced understanding of how human flourishing requires that we take seriously how our decisions impact others. Legal scholar Patricia Williams captures this relationship between the free-floating individual and the free market when she says, much of this has an urgency to its framing that exploits our anxiety about mortality itself. Hurry up, or you'll die of an ugly disease, and do so that we win the race, for everything's a race against time, a race to file patents, a race to market, a race to better babies, better boobs. There is never enough glory or gain. There is always the moving goalpost. Relatedly, we must remain vigilant about the way our definitions of genetic desirability are routinely seeded with ableist assumptions. Legal scholar Lisa Ikamoto predicts that as the list of conditions and traits considered undesirable expands, acceptance of persons with disabilities will narrow. So it becomes vital to include those who identify as disabled in decisions about the development of biotech. Anything less is presumptive and paternalistic. Likewise, let us insist upon an explicitly anti-racist ethos, lest we gloss over how already existing forms of alienation persist in what counts as relevant to the discussion. Current risk assessment frameworks, for example, focus too narrowly on safety. Even if a particular procedure is deemed safe, it can still exercise violence against particular groups, who, if human engineering procedures become routine, will likely be looked upon with contempt and/or pity. Relatedly, in acknowledging the dominance of agendas set in the US, Europe, and East Asia, let us be careful not to have our ethical imaginaries focus only upon these issues seen as controversial in these contexts. A decolonial ethics must take the geopolitics of science seriously, and as such attend to the growing US military involvement in biotech. No longer can we invoke the good intentions of researchers without attending to the multiple masters being served. Last but not least, wrestling with issues of distributive justice and equity should stand front and center. Exactly 1 mile away from where we sit, people wait over 12 hours to be treated in the ER of Grady Memorial Hospital. As UC Chancellor Professor Karis Thompson urges, we must collectively refuse the notion that questions of social justice are anti-science. In fact, they're the foundation of good science. In this way, we come full circle. What I'm describing as an expansive ethical imaginary, one that avoids the many fallacious constrictions I've described, is one that engages those who are socially and politically alienated at the table, not on the table, of the life sciences. Thinking from the margins with those who've been historically harmed and exploited in the name of progress offers us a more capacious understanding of what it can mean to do good science. already existing forms of social and political alienation become our starting point, not simply as problems to be solved, but as incisive perspectives that help to hone our thinking about biotechnology. With that, thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Jody Wong-Taylor, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. George Church is a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, director of the NIH Center for Excellence in Genomic Science, and founder of personalgenomics.org, an open access medical data site. His technologies led to the first genome sequence in 1994, various next-generation sequencing methods, the first genomically recoded organism in 2013, CRISPR RNA-guided gene drives and gene therapies, and innovations in biosafety and security, and innovations in data sharing, ethics, and policy. His honors include election to the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the 2011 Franklin Bauer Laureate for Achievement in Science. Please help me welcome Dr. George Church.
So I just want to start with a quote from Tom Lehrer. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. And as you've just heard a second ago, I've sent up a few rockets, and I do care where they go down. And have written a few, I think, innovative bioethics papers, including some with Jean-Tine Lunshoff as a co-author. So I'm quite excited about this particular get-together we have here about alien organisms. I think that scientists often are not encouraged, they don't encourage themselves to say the words should. But I think scientists should be listening at meetings like this, and they should be encouraged to say should. But should in order to do what? In order to help us to survive long-term the wisdom that we have, not just our greedy existence, and to survive long enough to avoid asteroids and various other very long-term risks. There's a risk of doing nothing. We have 7 billion people going on 10 billion, and doing nothing is not really an option. And it's always about cost versus benefits. The FDA and the EPA deal a little bit with safety and efficacy, but this conversation goes far beyond that. Safety and efficacy relative to current practices is not the only thing on the table. So I'll organize the couple of minutes on the vowels, A-E-I-O-U, so augmentation, elitism, invasive species, opportunistic slippery slope, and the unintended consequences. We have the augmentation can become addictive, as we just heard from the previous speaker. It can become very worrisome about the implications for the way we treat one another and the way we think of one another. The commoditization and of the way we think about our next generation. I think it's important for us to worry, especially to worry about the long term, even though it is very hard to predict, as Steven Pinker has said. We still have to do it anyway. When we get to elitism, it's not just about costs, although my group has worked very hard at helping to bring down the costs of some of these technologies. You've seen cell phones go from something that you can only carry around in your car, so you have a Rolls Royce to go with your mobile phone, to something that there's 6 billion mobile phones in the world. Not everybody has one, but many people have access. Similar things are happening in biotechnology. I've watched up close and personal next generation sequencing bring the cost down from about $3 billion to less than 1,000, and is continuing to plummet. And the same thing is happening for the synthetic genomics. But this elitism, this worry about the gap, whether it's getting bigger or getting smaller, the gap between the empowered and the powerless is still, should be front and center. We need education in order, they can't participate in the conversation that we're supposedly opening up here today without education, but it has to be a two-way. We need to become educated as well. And so, you know, when we talk about making technology available broadly, we have some success stories like smallpox is something where essentially everybody on the planet, whether or not they're educated, whether or not they participated in the discussion, they are protected from smallpox. I think that's something we probably would not want to reverse. And it was a technology that was even less expensive than vaccines in a certain sense. It was a vaccine, but the way we treat with smallpox today is there are no vaccines. It just doesn't exist anymore. We don't need to worry about multi-drug resistant smallpox because we eliminated it. We are in a position to do that for malaria now, as well as polio, because these are human-specific threats. And so the alien species that we're dealing with here are, the alien components are augmentation. This is the A. The augmentation of humans. Vaccines, I would submit, is augmentation, is not natural. It is extremely empowering, and it can affect rich and poor alike. It is often tested out on the wealthy first, just like cell phones could have melted our brains, and vaccines could have hurt Jenner's and Pasteur's first patients. It eventually impacts the herd, even if they're not vaccinated. I think germline editing, if that's on the agenda, and cloning are recurrent nightmares that come up again and again as a reflex, often not passing entirely through the cerebral cortex. But I think that we're worrying about the wrong things. We should worry, and we should worry about those, but it takes a generation for a clone or a germline edited embryo to get to maturity, while somatic effects, somatic gene therapies, could spread through the population as quickly as the cost permits. So are we worried about the cost being too high and creating inequities, or are we worried about the cost being too low and spreading like the latest music video or other viral event in the internet? So if you're worried about it spreading too quickly, it's good news that the first gene therapy that was approved in Europe, not in the United States, is 1.2 million euros. To me, this is very disappointing, and I think it will plummet, hopefully the same way that these other technologies I mentioned have come down by factors of 10 million or so. But it is where it is right now. We have gene drives to deal with invasiveness. This is a very technical conversation, not for today, but the summary is that there are, you can send a piece of DNA through them as, say, a mosquito population that will make it resistant to malaria. Won't necessarily influence the mosquitoes themselves, but they will become resistant to malaria, and hence it can spread exponentially through the population. But this is one of these things that has huge benefits and huge risks in principle, the unknown unknowns. It doesn't have any known risks, but we need to ramp up the discussion with ecologists and conservationists and people very knowledgeable about the unintended consequences of eliminating malaria. But we can't just dismiss it or delay it because 600,000 people die each year and millions more are deprived of livelihood and normal family life. So the opportunistic slippery slope becomes even bigger. There are many things, many technologies we've developed that did not result in a slippery slope. We don't all drive at maximum speed, our cars. But there are others, like weapons, from the first flint knife to dirty bombs. There is a slippery slope there that, again, we backed off from the brink with nuclear. Do-it-yourself microbiology and do-it-yourself genome engineering is quite something to discuss and consider. The cost reduction. And finally, these unintended consequences, these unnatural, unknown unknowns, long-term planning. We can have very short-term fixes that are even approved by a large body, such as the Food and Drug Administration, like Vioxx, or pesticides like DDT. Sometimes it takes a long time in phase 4 clinical trials or in the environment to see what the consequences actually are. It's not entirely, but you still need to keep bringing it up as it goes forward. Antibiotics can affect things well beyond what they're intended. It can affect our microbiome, which might impact our obesity epidemic. Sugar and meat and cholesterol. Sugar and cholesterol are at least as scary as genetically modified foods, but they don't get the same attention. Automobiles kill 1.2 million people, and I think we're aiming for really preventative medicine and preventative and technologies in general. Thank you.
So thank you very much to our speakers. Joining them on the panel, again, you'll get full introductions from these people, about these people when they give their individual talks, is Erica Haimes, Professor of Sociology from Newcastle University, Ubaka Ogbogu, and I want to point out that on your agendas, his name is missing. Solomon Nwaka, who was going to be here, could not attend, and so on your agenda sheet, Ubaka Ogbogu, and his bio is in your faculty bios, should be there. He's from the University of Alberta, where he's on the Faculty of Law, and Margaret Somerville, Professor of Law from McGill University. So thank you all for joining us, and this was a very interesting couple of talks in a topic that has sort of very broad application. We're talking about alien organisms, and that seems to take us down into the world of single-celled organisms and synthetic biology, and the question of new identities, which, as Ruha led us, takes us into this incredibly rich social science world of the nature of human interactions. And I think one of the things we struggle with in a conference-like beings and in our attempt to try to understand biotechnology is how to bridge those two worlds and what their relationship is. So first, I just want to invite you to comment on that, to respond to the talks that you heard, and then we'll continue with the conversation. Would anyone like to begin our conversation? Erica?
Thank you very much. I guess this is working. Here we are in the field of biotechnology, and if you haven't got a pocket, you have to use a special microphone. So forgive me for this. I was wondering what I would be able to contribute to this conversation in one respect, because I thought it might be too specialist for my own background. But I think the two speakers have given us a very effective inway into the debates. But certainly one of the concerns I had initially was not so much with the idea of an alien organism, but with a modified organism, the modification of organisms that we're used to, that we understand, and where the modifications of cells become less obvious and we're being told nothing much is happening, it's business as usual. And I'm thinking there about the idea of the modification of the embryo. And people will know here that in the UK, we've just had major debates about mitochondrial research and the 3-person embryo. And I was thinking in terms of the language of alien organisms, new identities, new entities, is that 3-person embryo a new entity? Certainly the person produced from it will have a new identity, an unexpected identity. But does that person become an alien organism, or is the 3-person embryo itself an alien organism? And I'm just wondering, as you said yourself, Paul, how you actually straddle those metaphorical designations, if you like. And just as a final point, to pick up on Ruha's analysis, which is this question about the prioritization of individual choice. And certainly in the UK, that was a strong element of the debate about mitochondrial research and moving into mitochondrial therapy, which was the choice of the parents when there are alternatives. So those are my sorts of questions that are stimulated by your contribution. Thank you.
Margaret?
Well, I'd like to follow up on that. I think that one of the themes that's coming out here, and I think it's an extraordinarily important one, is that words matter, that we euphemize and eulogize things in order to conceal what we really see as the inherent problems, ethical problems in those issues. And we have to be very careful of that. And the experimental psychologists, and here I'm sure that Stephen Pinker could talk much more about this than I could, but we're now being able to show that when we make ethical decisions, we don't make them primarily from a basis of reason, that we have what I call these other ways of human knowing, and among those, the imagination, especially the moral imagination, is enormously important. And so I would say what I'd call examined emotions. In ethics, we sometimes talk about the ethical yuck factor. And we don't know why we've said yuck, but when we go and examine why we've come to that conclusion, we find that there are ethical problems. And so for the scientists here, my warning would be that reason is essential. It's enormously important, but I would call it a secondary verification mechanism to help us to ensure that what we've decided on the basis of these other, usually perhaps, unconscious ways of knowing is indeed the ethical path that we should take. And in regard to words, I'd just like to mention that Paul, delivered these topics to us. And I looked at this one and I thought, well, alien. And I'd pick up on what Ruha said, and I think what she had to say was enormously important. Alien is an inclusion-exclusion mechanism. And it's mediated through just that one word, alien. And recently I was on a television show where it's a weekly show on a news channel in Canada. And they said, the third topic today is UFOs. And I thought, well, what do I know, about UFOs? But in fact, what it came down to was that could we imagine that there are people out there, aliens, unlike us? And what does that mean? And sometimes by looking at those things, we can get insights into very real and present and practical problems that we're currently facing. What I suggested was that we are the ants of the universe. That just as if you look at the giant anthills, I originally come from Australia, in northern Australia, those ants have got a total social organization, but I'm pretty sure they can't imagine the world outside their anthill. And I think that's the same for us. We can't imagine the world to a large extent, except if you're Margaret Atwood, the world outside our immediate reality. But this new technology is challenging us to do that, and that's why the ethical imagination is so important in what we do in science.
We very intentionally chose those words and connected alien organisms with new entities and identities in order to create that tension between the question of, there are incredibly strange organisms in this world, natural ones under the sea and things that we find in fossils, and yet somehow we consider those natural because they evolve. And is there something different about the organisms we create? Are they somehow alien because we as human beings created them? Just on the levels of how we think about organisms, it's a fascinating question. Ubaka, you can say something.
So I'd like to start off by saying that I think scientists very rarely define things. They very rarely create categories into which they want things to fit. The way I see scientists, at least the ones I've worked with, is they go into a lab or they go about their business every day and just do stuff. Bioethicists define things. Politicians define things. Words like aliens and identities and all those things are categories that are socially constructed, politically created, defined in a certain way and backed up in a certain way. I think when scientists go in to do whatever they do, they don't define what they do as maybe an alien organism or a new identity or any of that stuff. Biotech is not really creating new problems here. It is simply breathing new life into socially constructed categories that have always existed. It is breathing new life into issues of identity and difference that we've dealt with for a very long time, and we need to be mindful of that. It'll be good to get some perspective from scientists about how they see what they do, and not to focus too much on outcomes. We're going to get something that looks weird at the end of it, or talks weird, or behaves weird, but more about what scientists want to do, why they want to do it, and how we can help them do it in an ethical way. So I think the focus on outcomes, on that thing we see at the end that we can define as something that's politically constructed, might actually lead us away from prescriptions that help us regulate or govern the technologies that we're looking to govern.
So George, one of the things that synthetic biology promises to do is to create novel types of organisms, or at least new combinations of existing organic elements. Is there discussion in the community of scientists around the implications of that, not just scientifically, but its broader implications for, defining organisms, for thinking of the place of organisms in the family of living things on the planet? Is there talk at that level, or is it really more a bunch of organic engineers discussing technologies?
Well, I think the point that we just made is we don't spend a lot of time defining is partially true. It was historically very important to give Latin names to everything, but at the cutting edge of technology, you know it when you see it. And for example, the genomically recorded organism that we have, in principle, is not a new species; it's a new kingdom of life, because most organisms will exchange genetic material, and the whole intention of this is so that it cannot exchange genetic material. So I think that's a very profound thing to reflect on, although we don't make a big deal about it definitionally. I think to Ruha's point about diversity and labels and so forth, there is a tendency for technology and for society these days to increase diversity, at least of the things that we have. We have millions of new entities that are technological that you would not find in a traditional society. And that if that spills over into our life, it could make the differences that we see that are historical vanish in significance, or maybe get amplified. But there's a big difference there due to diversification as people move into cities and as technologies give new options. So for example, cell phones are not necessarily part of our ancient recognition of the stranger, of the xenophobia that we have. It's a new thing.
I just want to trouble a little bit the idea of the blank slate or the blank lab in which no classificatory processes are happening, because when we think about the importance of patenting and defining something that's novel, partly what's happening is setting boundaries in terms of different entities, whether genomic or cellular. What's not being defined and what's being taken as given are the social ideas and categories that are being used without thinking. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Peter Chow, did a content analysis of over 300 articles in the life sciences that engage with questions explicitly of race ethnicity, in which race was hardly ever defined, but was taken as given. That is, we know it when we see it. And that was not treated with the care, the definitional care, the classificatory care, in which the biological classifications and entities were being defined. And so that asymmetry is partly what's happening, is that we think we know the social when we see it. It's the thing that, we're taking at the intuitive level, which in practice means that we are reinscribing what we have come to learn in whichever society we have been acculturated. But the care in which all of the boundaries of biological entities are defined and said different from this is remarkable, right? And so I think what we want to do is have a much more symmetrical attention to the way in which and when we're deploying classifications, understanding that what we think of as common sense, we know it when we see it, is actually anything but.
So let me ask a very different kind of question and take us in a slightly different direction. It is possible, as we extrapolate into the future, that we are going to begin to create more and more and more organisms, and by the way, not only microorganisms, but also animals, that will begin to serve us through genetic modification. So we're already doing that with animals who can express drug molecules in their blood or milk through genetically modifying that. We're doing that to some degree through the possibility of synthetic biology, creating organisms that we use industrially, that we use, of course, to clean up oil spills. And then finally, the possibility that those kinds of organisms would enter into our everyday life, whether biosensors in our clothing, whether used in medical diagnosis. Now, we live awash in microorganisms that we pay no attention to, or we have a lot of attention recently on the microbiome and the fact that the majority of our mass as human beings is actually other organisms. But does it change our relationship and our thinking and our way of being in the world to all of a sudden be part of a network of newly created kinds of micro and non-microorganisms that have been modified in order to serve us, or to create products for us, or to make our lives easier? Is that somehow a game changer in the way in which we relate to the other organisms of the world?
Paul, I think that one of the questions that hasn't been asked here today yet is, are some of the things that we can now do inherently wrong? That means that no matter how much good we could do with them, we should not do them. And almost all of our discussion has been utilitarian or consequentialist analysis. What will be the harms if we do this? And I think that's a question that has to be asked there.
Okay. Erica?
So,
just 1 second.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to try and address your question directly, Paul, I think it must change how we are in the world, our being in the world. But I want to suggest that maybe it changes it in terms of the specifics rather than in the larger divisions that we draw. But that's not because I think there is a hard division between the natural and the unnatural, or the natural and the social, but that actually we're creating the notion of the natural through our social practices day by day. And that's not a new observation. People will know perhaps the work of Ludmila Jordanova, who talks about the languages of nature, that our construction of nature and what is the natural is so imbued with social values, social positioning, social perspective. We don't really have a natural world that is out there and that's about to be changed. And I think this sense of the alien tries to play into this idea that there is this other world out there, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's here all the time. through exactly your analogy, our bodies are exactly that, and they are part of us. So I think it probably doesn't, we can't get very far if we insist on this distinction between the natural and the unnatural, or the natural and the social.
So I promised myself I won't be a skeptic today, but I'm naturally a skeptical person. And your question does draw some skepticism from me. Two things about that. The first is there seems to be a focus in the way you phrase the question and in the discussion we're having, sort of on the idea that all of this stuff is actually achievable. Mm-hmm. I actually think we're far out from some of the things that we describe here. We're very smart. I mean, humans are smart, but we are not. When you add regulations and how we're able to achieve things and the time it takes to achieve things, we're looking at years away from any of these things actually happening. Most of it is actually, sort of aspirational in a sense, and whether we're going to be able to do that or not is a question. I also think that biotechnology should sometimes reflect on its failures as much as it reflects on its successes. We're not very good at advancing in this area, and before we get to the point where we're starting to worry about these new organisms doing the things that you described, I think we're even having to create the organism itself, it's a big challenge. It's going to take a lot of money, it's going to take NIH regulations, it's going to take all kinds of things to get there. The second thing is I think it's, and I hate to use this term, these are first world problems. Mm-hmm. There's ways we can actually help people now with things we have. We just need to improve it a little bit. As Ruha said, these people are probably aliens in our current world. And there's little things we could do to improve that. And I think spending so much time and energy focusing on things that are far out, when there could be small improvements that actually make a difference in people's lives. And I'll give a very specific example here. During the Ebola crisis, there was a World Health Organization thing that was put together, some big meeting about 6 doses of a vaccine. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the problem I'm describing here. Mm-hmm. An experimental vaccine that will most likely help 6 people, or you could basically help build more hospitals, or teach people how to do good public health, boots on the ground public health, mm-hmm. and save more lives and change more things than trying to focus on sort of this biotechnological improvement. 6 doses of a vaccine that will make a difference to 6 people. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. What we can achieve is limited. And how we can achieve that to do more good is probably different from the ways we think about it now.
All right, I invite you to make a last comment. Our time's up. Does anyone in the panel want to sum up with a comment before we move on to our delegate comments? Erica?
Sorry, just one very last comment. Picking up on your point, George, about, and I might have got the nuance wrong, so forgive me if I have, and I apologize in advance, but your point about the damage done by sugar and cholesterol, etc., but not getting the same attention as the concerns of biotechnology. But I think that's probably our point for those of us coming at this from a sociological point of view, which is, where are the resources going, and are they going in the most needed sections of society, or actually should we be reconfiguring? And I hate to say to a fellow academic, we should get less money, but there is, I think, a bit of a question there in terms of the politics of what we're talking about, and Ruha's point, which is who's deciding where these resources go, and who should be making those decisions, because if we've already talked about issues of trust and public communication, I think that has to be part of the discussion as well. So.
Great. Thank you very much, panel. I invite you to return to your seats, and we will, yes, thanks. Let's thank our panel.